In March 1944, deep in the European night, the cold was sharp enough to freeze a breath in mid-air. In eastern Germany, on a flat stretch of sandy ground ringed by pine forest, stood a prisoner of war camp built for a particular kind of captive. Its official name was the Third Air Force Prisoner of War Camp, Stalag Luft III. The men held here were not ordinary infantry. They were Allied airmen, shot down and taken alive. Pilots from the Royal Air Force, from Canada, Australia and New Zealand, from Poland and from the United States. Knights of the sky, now contained behind wire. On the night of March 24th, nothing on the surface seemed unusual. Searchlight beams swept the compound like pale fingers, again and again tracing the open sand, the wooden hut walls, and the two tall rings of fencing. In the watchtowers, German guards flickered in and out of the glare. In the cold air came distant, muffled commands and the soft rasp of boots on sand. By regulation, at 9 o'clock, every prisoner had to be inside his own barrack. But on the eastern side of the camp, inside a hut numbered 104, the air was drawn tight as a bowstring. Dozens of men, dressed in assorted civilian clothes that fit poorly and looked faintly suspicious in color, sat without speaking or stood with their backs to the wall. In the dim light, their eyes were almost unnaturally bright. Their ears were cocked, measuring each patrol's footfalls, each shift in the searchlights as they passed. From time to time, their gaze slid toward the center of the room. There sat a heavy iron stove. Beneath it was a patch of floorboards that looked no different from any other. Time crawled toward midnight. If you could pierce those boards and look down, you would see a suffocating scene. Less than a meter beneath the hut, a tunnel, barely 60 centimeters square, just wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, extended forward through the earth like an ugly, stubborn worm. Its walls were braced with rough slats pried from bedboards. Moisture beaded on the splintered supports. The tunnel was almost completely dark, except at the far front where a pea-sized flame trembled in a lamp made from an empty milk tin. The man lay flat on a homemade wooden sled. He worked with a section of stolen heating pipe, ground into a tool, scraping away the last stubborn handfuls of sand. Slowly, carefully, as if speed itself could kill him. Above his head was no longer the hut's floor. It was the real soil of Germany, unguarded land. Ahead, not far away, the tunnel ended at a vertical shaft sealed by a wooden board. At the top of that shaft was a second, disguised exit hatch. Above that hatch waited the icy wind, the thin shadows of pine trunks, and the world beyond the wire. This tunnel's code name was Harry. Up on the surface, in Hut 104, the men knew the signal to begin might come in minutes. The first among them would shift the stove, pry up the hidden floor, and slide into that black, wet, airless throat. He would begin a crawl of more than 100 meters to reach a hatch that meant freedom. But they also knew this plan had never been aimed at a single man's escape. From the start, it was a declaration, an unprecedented act of provocation. The plan called for 200 men to file through Harry tonight, one after another. That number, 200, would become a bitter footnote. In reality, only 76 men would make it out into the open, and colder still, of those 76, 50 would have their lives cut short after the escape, executed as a warning. This is not merely a story about breaking out of prison. It is a chain, complete from end to end, from a carefully engineered miracle of underground construction to an ice-blooded war crime. And it begins here, on a night that looks calm from the outside, in March 1944. To understand the madness and the grandeur of that night, you first have to understand the dead end from which they dared to plan it. Stalag Luft III was built by the German Luftwaffe as a model prison for Allied airmen. The men who ran it clung to a peculiar idea of chivalry. They believed aerial combat was a duel between gentlemen, and therefore captured pilots deserved relatively decent treatment. Food met the standards of the Geneva Convention. Prisoners could receive Red Cross parcels. They could organize bands, rehearse plays, even hold boxing matches. But behind that veneer of decency was a physical design the Germans believed was foolproof. The camp sat on distinctive sandy soil. When dry, it was loose as sugar and collapsed the moment you dug. When damp, it turned heavy and sticky, clogging tools and tunnels alike. German engineers had chosen the site precisely to pose the first unsolvable obstacle to anyone who dreamed of digging out. All the wooden huts were raised neatly off the ground. Their floors sat a full 60 centimeters above the sand. On patrol, guards could simply bend down and look beneath every hut, checking every inch. On patrol, guards could simply bend down and look beneath every hut, checking every inch. There were no blind spots. Try to start a tunnel under your bed, and you would be seen at once. Around the compound were 2 3-meter-high rings of barbed wire, fitted with bells and traps. Beyond the wire lay an open strip, cleared bare, the death zone. Watchtowers stood everywhere. At night, searchlights overlapped into a net of light. Inside were nearly 10,000 men, some of the world's smartest, boldest, and least willing to accept captivity. Guarding them were roughly 800 German sentries. Many survivors later described the situation as a uniquely subtle torment. You had a measure of comfort, but you lived inside a glass bowl. You knew the guards to some extent respected your status as a soldier, but you also knew that respect depended on you staying obediently inside the cage they built for you. Freedom became an ever-present temptation in the air, an unreachable torment. So for certain men in the camp, escape stopped being a personal impulse, a private gamble. It rose into something else, a collective, organized military operation, a systematic contest of intelligence against the jailers. A Royal Air Force Lieutenant Colonel named Roger Bushell was precisely that kind of escape master. He formed a highly professional escape committee with departments like a real organization: intelligence, forgery, logistics, and tunneling. Their doctrine was blunt. If you were a prisoner of war, your primary duty was to escape by any means and force the enemy to spend time and resources hunting you down. And to Bushell and his committee, Stalag Luft III's sand and raised huts were not an unsolvable prison. They were an engineering problem waiting to be systematically defeated. If the sand collapsed easily, then build denser, smarter supports. If there was nowhere to hide at ground level, dig deeper, down below the guards' sightlines and beyond the reach of ordinary detection. If one man's labor was limited, then organize hundreds like a company, each with a defined job. Under the rhythm of boots and the sweep of searchlights, one of the strangest and largest underground projects in the history of warfare began quietly in the enemy's heartland. They were not digging one tunnel. They were digging 3 as backup and insurance. They gave them codes that sounded harmless, almost cozy: Tom, Dick, and Harry. The entrance to Tom was hidden in a dark, neglected corner of a hut. Dick's entrance lay beneath a patch of concrete floor in a corner, extraordinarily well concealed. Harry's entrance was the most audacious of all, right in the center of Hut 104, directly under the heavy iron stove used every day. Sometimes the most dangerous place is the safest, but an entrance and determination were not enough. The true miracle was the social machine that made the project run, precise as clockwork. More than 600 prisoners took part directly in digging, logistics, and preparation. They came from every background, and inside the camp, their skills were rediscovered and repurposed. At the core were the diggers. They were usually the smallest men, the toughest in will. They lay on homemade wooden sleds and worked for hours inside a tunnel barely 60 centimeters high and roughly as wide. Their tools were homemade, heating pipes stolen from the camp, ground into small shovels and pry bars. Their lighting was homemade, empty milk tins filled with hoarded cooking fat, a strip of cloth twisted into a wick. Ventilation was engineered, milk tins from Red Cross parcels joined into an air duct and hand-built bellows to push air down the line. Every step carried enormous risk. Every tiny creak of the wooden supports could mean a collapse, a burial alive. And yet the harder problem, the one that demanded the most ingenuity, was not the digging. It was what to do with the seemingly endless sand. Over thousands of meters of tunnel, the excavated sand amounted to tons. It could not be piled in a corner. It could not be dumped on the parade ground. Even a small handful of sand with the wrong color could trigger suspicion. So the escape committee invented a brilliant sand disposal system. Its most famous component became known as the Penguin Squad. Men assigned to move sand wore specially altered trousers with long cloth bags sewn inside the legs. The diggers filled those hidden bags. Then the penguins tied off the cuffs, stood up, and walked out. From a distance they looked like ordinary prisoners taking a stroll, except their gait was odd, their calves heavy and swollen. They wandered to all corners of the camp, near the exercise yard, by the gardens, along the edge of the trees. Then, pretending to tie a shoelace or stretch, or simply strolling at an idle pace, they released the sand through a concealed mechanism at the cuff. It trickled out like an hourglass, slow, steady, dispersed onto the real ground. A casual scuff of a boot blended it into the surrounding soil. From afar, the waddling figures truly did resemble a flock of clumsy penguins. That image would become one of the most enduring symbols of the Great Escape, collective intelligence laced with dark humor. Meanwhile, the other production lines ran at full speed. In the forgery shop, gifted artists used homemade quills and ink to imitate the flamboyant signatures of German officials, producing identity papers, travel permits, and leave documents convincing enough to survive casual inspection. In the tailoring room, men tore fabric from Red Cross parcels or repeatedly bleached and redyed the dark blue coats of the Royal Air Force into something closer to German civilian clothing. Mapmakers working from stolen references or memory copied routes and rail lines. A food committee quietly stockpiled chocolate, sugar, and hard biscuits for the road. Everything proceeded in silence, under discipline. New prisoners were vetted and, if trusted, folded into the system and assigned a role. Each man knew only the portion connected to his task. Only a handful at the top understood the full architecture. It was a vast machine, assembled in secret, running beneath the enemy's feet, each gear a living man, each driven by the same hunger, freedom. The project was not smooth. Then came the hardest blow. The first tunnel to near completion, Tom, was discovered by the guards. The Germans poured water into it and destroyed months of work. Despair spread through the compound, but the escape committee made a swift decision. Concentrate all resources on Harry. Dick, already dug to a substantial length, would be converted into an emergency storage space and a backup passage. Hope was set, carefully, almost fearfully, upon the ever-lengthening body of the Harry tunnel. Spring 1944 advanced. Allied offensives intensified on both fronts. Inside the camp, hope rose alongside unease. They had to act before the war ended suddenly, before shifting conditions made the plan impossible. At last, in March 1944, the tunnel reached its measured length. The exit was to open beyond the camp's wire, beneath the shadow of the pines. The camouflage was exquisite, a hatch topped with sod and scattered leaves, indistinguishable from the forest floor. Everything was ready. The date was set. March 24th, a moonless night. The list was finalized. 200 men. The order was arranged according to language ability, the quality of forged documents, physical condition, and contribution to the escape committee. Civilian clothes were distributed. Food pouches were slung over shoulders. Then came the hardest part. Waiting. Waiting for full darkness. Waiting for the searchlight's pattern. Waiting for the brief lull at a guard change. A little after 8, the signal came. They could begin. In Hut 104, the first escapee drew a deep breath. With the help of his comrades, he silently shifted the heavy iron stove aside and lifted the disguised floorboard beneath. A black hole of earth smell opened in the middle of the room. He turned and looked once at the men crowded behind him, their eyes shining with encouragement and fear. Then he bent, slid into the opening, and eased the floorboard back into place above his head. The Harry tunnel swallowed its first passenger. The assembly line started. Crawling through that tunnel was a torment beyond ordinary imagination. Those who made the trip later described a sensation that mixed claustrophobia, physical exhaustion, and violent excitement. The space was so tight you could not lift your head or turn over. Elbows and knees rubbed against rough bracing and gritty sand until skin broke, scabbed, and broke again. The only light ahead was a pea-sized flame. Behind you crawled another man in the same darkness. The air was stale and damp, earthy, sweaty, sharp with the stinging smoke of burning fat. Worst of all were the sounds overhead, muted through layers of soil, the vibration of boots, faint voices, perhaps the distant rumble of a vehicle. You could not know what those sounds meant. You could only move, drag yourself forward toward the exit that existed, in theory, at the far end. In the dark, time lost meaning. 20 minutes, perhaps. An hour, perhaps. Finally, the man in front reached the base of the vertical shaft and found the wooden ladder rising upward. He climbed carefully. Above his head was the disguised hatch. He paused, pressing an ear to the wood, listening. Only wind, and far away the soft roar of pines. He pushed gently. The hatch gave. The first true breath of free air, icy and sharp, poured down and nearly made him cough. He fought the impulse, climbed out and scanned the forest. Black trunks. Quiet. No one. He restored the hatch, then, exactly as planned, crawled low toward the designated gathering point. It worked. The first man was out. A signal went back to the entrance by some method agreed in advance, and the second man slipped into the tunnel. The line accelerated. 1, 2, 3. Men emerged at the forest's edge like droplets seeping from the earth, then vanished into deeper darkness. On the surface, the camp remained calm. Searchlights swept in their established rhythm. Patrols walked their familiar routes. The Germans noticed nothing. Beneath them, a human current flowed out from the cage. The 10th, the 20th, the 30th. Progress was slower than hoped. There were minor clogs in the tunnel. Men moved at uneven speed. Cold and fear drained strength. But men were getting out, one after another. The night deepened. Time bled away. Dawn, when the operation would have to stop, crept closer. Above ground, members of the escape committee calculated anxiously. At this pace, they would never get 200 men out in time. They made a painful decision. Skip some names later in the order, men less prepared, and prioritize those with the best chance of success. Even so, the pressure was crushing. Every man who entered the tunnel carried the hope of the whole camp and also the risk of exposing everything. The 50th. The 60th. Inside the hut, those waiting felt a storm of emotions. Exhilaration at each success, fear that their own turn would never come, dread as the clock tightened. Then came the 76th man. He slid into the tunnel, pushing toward the exit. Behind him, the 77th crouched near the entrance, ready, waiting for his signal. Above ground, the 76th man hauled himself out, restored the hatch, and disappeared into the night like the other 75. The man assigned to manage the exit was about to settle the hatch fully and send word down for the next man to climb. In that instant, the accident came. Small enough to be almost nothing, lethal enough to end everything. The precise details vary across records and survivor accounts. The most widely repeated version is this: a German guard, perhaps driven by necessity, perhaps simply straying from his usual route, walked toward the edge of the pines. He came within 20 meters of the Harry Tunnel's exit. He may have stepped onto ground that felt too soft. He may have heard something, a faint shift as the hatch settled, a sharp inhale. Or, out of professional suspicion, he simply stopped, raised a flashlight, and shone it into the darkness. The beam swept over trunks and brush and caught a human shape that had not yet fully hidden. Perhaps the 76th escapee, perhaps the man handling the hatch. Time froze. Then a startled German shout, strained and high with alarm, ripped the night open. "Halt! Wer da?" Stop. Who's there? Almost at once, a shrieking siren burst from the nearest watchtower, carrying through the entire camp. Searchlights, as if awakened by instinct, snapped toward the woods and flooded the area with white daylight. It was over. At the entrance, inside Hut 104, every man heard the siren. Blood turned to ice. The entrance was sealed and disguised with frantic speed. Those who had not entered the tunnel knew the escape had been exposed. They had to destroy all evidence, maps, papers, tools, change back into uniforms, and pretend nothing had happened. Inside the Harry Tunnel, the tragedy was worse for the men still crawling. The 77th man might have gone only 10 or 15 meters. Behind him might have been the 78th, the 79th, and more. They were now trapped in the tunnel's middle. No forward path because the exit was compromised, no easy retreat because the entrance was closed and likely to be searched. Buried alive in a sandy throat, they could only pray the Germans would not flood the tunnel and that they might find some hidden branch before discovery. Above ground, those who had escaped but had not yet reached safety transformed in seconds from shadows to prey under a spotlight. German shouts and the barking of dogs surged in from all directions. The hunt began immediately. A great plan. A precise engineering miracle. Nearly a year of labor by hundreds of men. All of it shattered in a few seconds by a single, accidental alarm. The numbers locked themselves into history. Planned, 200. Real, 76. 76 men had broken the surface and breathed a few minutes of free air, but the ground beneath them was still Germany. What lay ahead was a Third Reich fully awakened, furious, humiliated, and now throwing out a net of steel. And the price they would pay, along with the comrades who never made it out, would soon exceed anything they had imagined. The siren was like a cold blade, cutting away the last thread of luck in that March night. For the 76 men who had already slipped out into Germany's darkness, the alarm changed the game's nature completely. They were no longer escapees sneaking out of a tightly managed camp. They became publicly wanted enemies of the state. The Third Reich's police and military machine, enraged by an escape of this scale, spun up at full speed. The Gestapo, the criminal police, the Wehrmacht, even the Hitler Youth received orders. Photographs, descriptions, and likely aliases were rushed to every train station, bus depot, hotel, and border checkpoint. Radios carried pursuit directives. In the countryside, military police with dogs began to comb forests and fields in widening sweeps. For most escapees, their freedom was fragile as the last mist before dawn. The first thing that broke many of them was the weather. Eastern Germany in March was still bitterly cold. Their thin civilian clothes had been chosen for concealment, not warmth. Many men escaped without coats. After a single night outdoors, hypothermia became as dangerous as the patrols. Then came hunger. The small ration of compressed food they carried could not last long under stress and cold. Searching for food meant approaching farms and villages, meaning the risk of exposure soared. The greatest obstacle remained language and identity. The forged papers could be excellent, but a German sentence spoken with an English, Polish, or French accent could unravel a disguise in seconds. Most of them knew little of Germany's geography, transportation routines, even ordinary habits. One harmless-seeming question, which side of the square does the bus to such and such town leave from, could be enough to break the mask. So, one after another, the escapees were identified at railway platforms, in guest house registers at borderlines, and taken in, handcuffed, transported back into custody. Some made it only a few miles before dogs found them in nearby woods. Some managed to board trains but were reported by conductors after nervous behavior or a wrong answer at inspection. Only a few, armed with extraordinary language skill, flawless papers, improbable luck and hard nerves, slipped through the checks. The final numbers were cold and certain. Of the 76, only 3 ultimately reached neutral territory and gained true freedom. 2 reached Sweden. 1 reached Spain. They were the only tiny winners of a massive gamble. The other 73 were all recaptured within days or weeks. If the story ended there, it would still be an achievement fit for history. Through unmatched engineering ingenuity and collective discipline, it humiliated the German POW system and lifted Allied morale. It was a tactical failure, but a strategic and spiritual victory. But history turned here into a darker channel. Capture was painful, but still within the normal logic of war. They were soldiers. Escape was duty. Recapture was a risk. Under the Luftwaffe's comparatively decent management tradition, and within the Geneva Convention framework, the likeliest fate for recaptured airmen was return to camp, perhaps punishment, perhaps solitary confinement. But their lives should have been safe. This time it was different. The scale, organization, and open defiance of the escape enraged the Nazi leadership, especially Adolf Hitler himself. In his eyes, this was not a simple breakout. It was public contempt for his authority, a mockery of German efficiency, and a dangerous precedent. If such audacity was not punished with the most brutal retaliation, other camps would follow and order would collapse. In that fury, Hitler summoned senior party figures and secret police chiefs and issued a spoken order. There was no formal document, but the intent was clear. A warning had to be written in blood. The order demanded that most of the recaptured men, especially organizers and leaders, be executed. That highest directive seeped swiftly into the Gestapo and criminal police systems. It became a political task, a performance of terror meant to deter future escapes. Efficiency, Law, and even the Luftwaffe's lingering habits of chivalry became irrelevant beneath the weight of political command. A hidden selection began. Using the camp's records, where suspected organizers were marked, along with interrogation behavior, rank and nationality, the Gestapo drew up a list. In the months that followed, many recaptured airmen did not experience the ordinary process of registration, confinement, and returned to Stalag Luft III. They were held longer, interrogated further, then one day they were told they were being transferred. Handcuffed, shoved into black vehicles with no windows, they were driven away from police stations and transit holding sites. They were not headed back to the familiar sandy camp. They were taken into remote forests, into prison basements, out to lonely execution grounds. From evidence gathered after the war, through the Nuremberg proceedings and subsequent investigations, a cruel pattern was pieced together. These Allied airmen were accused of fabricated offenses, attempting to escape again or conducting espionage during flight. Without any military court, without even basic procedural formality, they were shot by firing squads. The executions were quick and quiet. One or several short gunshots in the stillness of dawn or dusk, followed by silence longer than any echo. Then, to erase traces and maximize intimidation, most of the bodies were cremated on the spot. The ashes were collected into crude containers and deliberately sent back to Stalag Luft III. The Germans erected a small memorial within the camp, heavy with insult, and displayed the urns. Prisoners were assembled and forced to look. The message was stated plainly. This is what happens when you organize escape and dare to challenge the Third Reich. It was the final blow, meant to crush resistance psychologically. It meant this: if you run, you will not only die, you will be handled with contempt. Your dignity will be stomped flat. 50 men. 50 young lives. They came from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Poland, Norway, South Africa, and more. They were lieutenants, captains, majors. They were fighter pilots, bomber crewmen, gunners. Many had been respected aces before they were shot down. They should have gone home after the war, embraced their families, begun the lives that waited for them. Instead, their names hardened onto a list of the dead, a document that was no longer a roster of escape participants, but proof of a war crime. In 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed and the war ended, the Allies moved quickly to investigate. The mass escape from Stalag Luft III and the subsequent executions became a priority case because of its clear scale and nature. Investigators found burial and cremation sites, struggled to identify remains, gathered witness testimony. Officials and police leaders who had passed along and carried out the killings were tracked down. In later trials after Nuremberg and in special proceedings before British military courts, several high-ranking Gestapo officials were charged. The trials revealed how the order traveled down the chain. Hitler was dead and beyond prosecution, but those who executed the crime could not shelter behind the excuse of following orders. Many of the officials directly responsible for arranging the shootings were sentenced to death or long prison terms. The law, though late, recovered at least a formal measure of justice for those 50 names. On a more human level, another operation unfolded, one conducted with dignity. The Royal Air Force organized a special search unit whose duty was to find and recover the remains of the 50 men. It was delicate, solemn work. Following leads, the team moved through forests and fields in eastern Germany, excavating carefully, identifying, gathering ashes and fragments, and placing them into new, respectful containers. These airmen did not return to their separate hometowns. They were buried together in a permanent, solemn place, the old Garrison War Cemetery in Poznań, Poland. If you go there today, you find a broad, quiet lawn. Hundreds upon hundreds of white stone markers stand in orderly rows. Each bears a name, a rank, a unit, a date of death, and a small emblem of the Royal Air Force, or another Allied air arm. Sunlight falls on the stones. Wind moves through the grass. Around them, dark evergreens keep watch. Look closely at the death dates and you will notice many fall in March 1944. Many more cluster in late March, the weeks after the escape. They lie side by side, as they once lay shoulder to shoulder near the entrance to the Harry Tunnel, waiting their turn. Those silent white stones are the heaviest, most enduring annotation to the story. They do not speak. They do not need to. They tell everything. After the war, Hollywood took hold of this history and in 1963 released the famous film The Great Escape. The cast was brilliant, the pace tight, the dialogue quick, the action vivid. The image of Steve McQueen's American airman trying to jump a motorcycle over a fence became an icon of cinema. The film carried an optimistic, unbroken spirit that shaped how later generations imagined the escape. But the film made one crucial shift. It ended on a brighter, more encouraging note, implying most major characters succeeded, or at least that hope prevailed. It softened, because art and market demanded it, the brutal reality that 50 men were executed. The film made the escape memorable, the suspense, the ingenuity, the thrill of outwitting an enemy. That is not wrong. But the true history contained no romance. The true ending lies in Poznań, in orderly cold white markers carved with names and the same year. Film magnifies legend. A gravestone measures cost. Year after year, the wind passes over those stones with a low, grieving sound, as if asking the same question without fatigue. And far away in Germany, the sandy ground that once held Stalag Luft III has long since been reclaimed by dense forest. The human marks, huts, wire watchtowers, have disappeared. The 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, collapsed long ago under time and nature, buried beneath soil and rot until no trace remains. Above and below, noise and silence, all of it has settled into calm. And yet, when we return our gaze to that night in March 1944, 2 symbols stand out with startling clarity. One is the tunnel mouth, the dark, wet, narrow opening that demanded a man curl his body just to pass. It led to the unknown, to danger, but also to a brief, priceless possibility. It symbolizes the spark that refuses to die in a dead end, the desire for freedom, resistance against captivity, and the astonishing creativity and organization that can erupt under extreme constraint. The number 76 is proof of the spark's brightness. The other is the white stone markers, identical rows standing quiet under sunlight. The names carved into them once belonged to bodies that laughed, raged, and flew. They symbolize how a machine of violence can grind down individuals, how political fanaticism can trample the basic rules of war and the bottom line of human dignity, and how every great action can carry a terrible cost. The number 50 is the weight of that cost, measured and set in stone. Between the tunnel and the gravestone stretches the full truth of war. It is not only a legend of heroic blood. It is not only a lament for innocent victims. It is the knot of both, intelligence and madness, courage and cruelty, hope and despair, braided together. We tell the story of the Great Escape not merely to relive a brilliant adventure, but to understand what enormous, meticulous effort human beings have been willing to invest for a chance at freedom. We remember those 50 names not merely to accuse a crime, but to warn ourselves when institutions shed their human skin and slide into pure terror. The damage they can do is deep beyond measure. True remembrance is not selective memory. It is not choosing only the bravery we want to celebrate and turning away from the pain we do not want to face. True remembrance is seeing both the tunnel and the gravestones. It is remembering how high human cooperation can climb and how deep human violence can fall. And between that height and that depth, the blurred, vital line that separates them may be the most enduring legacy this story leaves us to think about again and again.